Rain struck the market awnings in hard, slanting lines, and Elizabeth Ivanov nearly lost her footing where cabbage leaves and horse mud had turned the stones slick as oil. The crate in her arms was not heavy enough to excuse a gentleman from helping her, yet heavy enough to cut into the base of both thumbs until the skin felt flayed. Circulating library ledgers, bound in warped leather and swollen by damp, pressed against her ribs every time she breathed. Her gloves had been thin before the rain began. By the time she reached the edge of Covent Garden, they had gone translucent at the fingers, and the cold had entered her hands like pins. Her hem slapped her shins with each step. Water ran down the back of her neck, beneath her frayed collar. She had eaten nothing since yesterday evening, because Mrs. Norwood had looked at the breakfast tray, lifted the cover and instructed the maid to remove it without comment. Hunger made the world vivid and distant at once. She smelled roasted chestnuts from a brazier and almost turned toward it. She did not. She passed flower girls with their baskets wilted by weather, fishmongers shouting over one another, a pair of powdered women under a lacquered umbrella who glanced at her once and then through her as though need itself had made her transparent. The men who came in and out of the coffee house stepped around her skirts and did not break stride. Her dark hair had escaped its pins in wet ropes that clung to her pale cheeks and jaw. People called her plain when they spoke of her at all. They had been repeating it for years. The word sat on her like another wet garment, badly fitted and stubborn, while her eyes, too large for the narrowness of her face, held steady on the bookseller's lane ahead because steadiness was the only thing she could still afford. A wheel splashed foul water across her boots as a carriage lurched past, and the coachman did not bother with apology. Behind her, 2 apprentices carrying crates of oranges laughed. One of them said not quietly, "That is Norwood's burden, is it not?" The other answered, "Ivanov debt in a borrowed dress." They were boys with orange peel beneath their nails. They had learned the language of contempt from their elders and used it well. Elizabeth kept walking, her shoulders drawn inward to protect the crate, and nothing else. The rain had darkened her wool dress to near black, and the patched seam at her left elbow had opened again. Through it, her sleeve lining showed like old bone. At the butcher's corner, Mrs. Norwood's words from an hour earlier followed her as faithfully as the weather. "Deliver these ledgers yourself. I will not waste coin on a cart for your clumsiness. The accounts will be reconciled by dusk. If they are not, you will sleep in the scullery." She had said it in a tone soft enough to sound gracious to listeners, while lavender and rosewater drifted from her silk cuffs and the butcher bowed as if receiving a lady's favour. Then she had added, to no one in particular and to everyone within hearing, "Miss Ivanov is useful only when watched. She has inherited her father's disorder and his debts." That had earned sympathetic clucks from women who had once borrowed translations from Edward Ivanov and praised his hand at the piano after supper. No one corrected her. No one ever did. By 3:30, the rain had driven even the gossiping matrons under cover, and still Elizabeth crossed the square on blistering feet with the ledger crate biting into her palms, watched by strangers and seen by none. Her father had died in the study at Ivanov House in late winter, with ink dried in a crescent across his cuff, and a grammar of Sophocles open face down on the carpet. She remembered the shape of his hand on the page more clearly than his funeral prayers. Creditors had stood in the hall before the candles cooled. Men who had once praised his brilliance had turned practical overnight. They inventoried rugs. They weighed silver. They spoke of obligations in clean voices, while she sat in the side parlour with her mother's hand in hers, and listened to the scrape of furniture being marked for sale. Fever took her mother before autumn ended. After that, Mrs. Norwood entered the household by legal document and social confidence, wearing satin that rustled like dry leaves and carrying keys on a ribbon at her waist. Warm rooms were let to tenants. The morning room became storage. Her father's correspondence vanished into locked chests. The original trust papers, signed before witnesses and intended to secure Elizabeth's dowry, were misfiled, then under review, then never mentioned unless she asked, at which point she was reminded that gratitude ought to replace curiosity in a dependent woman. The phrase changed, the meaning did not. She was moved from her old chamber to an attic room where wind came through the casement in winter and flies came through it in summer. Her wages for managing the annex accounts never appeared in coin. The value, Mrs. Norwood said, lay in board, mending, and moral instruction. Board meant thin broth. Mending meant her own needle by candle end. Moral instruction meant correction delivered in front of servants, tradesmen, and guests. The house that had once held her father's laughter now held ledgers, locks, and the scent of lavender in every room where she was not welcome to sit. When she finally reached Norwood's circulating library, the bell above the door gave a tired metal rattle, and no one came at once to take the crate from her. She stood in a puddle of tracked rain and waited while the front clerk completed his flirtation with a lady selecting a volume of sermons she would never open. Her fingers had stiffened around the wood handles. She had to set one knee against the crate to lower it without dropping it on the tiles. The effort sent a bright streak of pain across her lower back. She straightened too quickly and saw black at the edges of her vision. The clerk turned then, glanced at the water dripping from her sleeves, and pinched his mouth. "You are late, Miss Ivanoff." He did not ask about the storm or the distance. He nudged the crate with his shoe as though testing produce. "Mrs. Norwood says your figures from March are suspect. You will remain in the annex until corrected." Elizabeth touched her wet hair behind one ear and answered with the calm she used when calm was all she had. The March figures balanced to the penny. He lifted one shoulder. "Then you may prove it again." He walked away before she could reply, calling for tea. The annex sat behind the lending desk, reached by a narrow passage where the plaster sweated in damp weather, and the shelves smelled of paste, leather, and mouldering pasteboard. That smell had become, in spite of everything, a kind of shelter to her. Here labour had shape, torn spines could be stitched, loose signatures could be rethreaded, ink blots could be corrected if one had patience and enough blotting paper. She lit a lamp, though it was not yet evening, because rain had turned the small windows to grey mirrors. Then she set the ledgers in order, one by one, while water pooled beneath her chair, and the hunger in her belly pulled and twisted like a tightened cord. She worked through the ache in her hands until the raw skin at the heel of her right palm reopened and left a crescent stain on scrap paper. She wrapped it in linen torn from an old handkerchief and kept writing. Numbers marched across the page. Borrowed copies, late penalties, replacement fees, binding costs. A pair of military histories never returned by a colonel who would dine at her stepmother's table next week and speak of honour. Ink feathered where drops from her cuff fell on the margins. She blotted, recalculated, and began again. Outside the annex wall, she heard the lending room murmur rise and fall. Names she knew by title, not by face. Footfalls in polished boots, a woman laughing at a line she had not read. When evening requests came in, the clerk pushed them through the side hatch without looking at her. "Repair this, mark that missing, copy these subscriptions cleanly for Mrs. Norwood." The stack grew. Her shoulders burned. Her throat felt scraped hollow. At some point a maid from the neighbouring print shop brought in a tray of tea for the front counter and paused at the annex door long enough to whisper, "There is one heel of bread left in the basket." Elizabeth thanked her and did not move to take it until the maid had gone, because small kindnesses could become punishments if seen by the wrong eyes. The bread was stale and hard at the crust. It tasted like grace. She ate it in 3 careful bites and returned to the ledgers, with her spine straight, her lips pressed bloodless, and her father's old maxim repeating in her mind with each line she copied. Accuracy is a form of dignity when all else is stripped away. Dusk came early under rain cloud. The bells from St. Paul's carried thinly through the weather, and the annex lamp threw her shadow long across the floorboards. In the narrow hour between daylight and full dark, she took out the notebook she kept hidden behind a cracked atlas and opened to a page crowded with small, disciplined script. Quotations from Homer in her father's translation, a stanza of Pushkin copied from memory, then corrected against an old edition when she found one on the sale shelf, notes on grammar, notes on rhythm, notes on how a sentence could hold pain without bowing to it. Mrs. Norwood could confiscate dresses, meals and rooms. She could order labour until Elizabeth's hands trembled. She could stand in a bright drawing room and call her stepdaughter a burden with silk at her throat and approval at her back. She could not enter this page without first learning what it contained, and she had never cared to learn. That refusal had become Elizabeth's one private fortune. She copied 2 more lines, while rain thudded against the shutters and the lending room emptied above her. Then she slid the notebook away, wiped the table with the edge of her sleeve, and reached for the next torn volume waiting to be mended before night. She drew the torn volume closer, set the bone folder beside the lamp, and threaded her needle by habit rather than sight, because her fingers knew the motion even when they shook. The book had once belonged to her father's shelves, or one from the same printer at least, calfskin darkened at the spine and marbled boards rubbed pale at the corners by years of hands that expected permanence. She opened it and felt the cracked hinge give with a tired sigh. Paste, thread, pressure, patience. He had taught her those 4 words when she was 11, and proud of being trusted near his desk. He had smelled then of wool, old tobacco, and the iron tang of ink. He had not corrected her for speaking Russian and English in one sentence. He had only smiled, touched her temple with 2 ink-stained fingers, and told her language was a house with many doors if one had courage enough to open them. That room had been bright once, fire laid before supper, curtains drawn against a November wind, her mother reading by the window in a shawl edged with blue silk. Then winter, debt, fever, and silence had taken each warmth in turn. She stitched the text block to fresh chords and remembered creditors lifting books as if they were poultry at market, shaking them to test value, laughing over titles they could not pronounce. She pressed the new end paper flat and remembered the day the silver samovar vanished, then the walnut escritoire, then her mother's portrait from the stair landing, sold to a dealer who called it sentimental provincial work and paid in coin that did not reach the servants' wages. The hunger in her belly pulled harder as she bent over the work. She ignored it. The annex door stood ajar for air, and through it she could hear rain ticking on the rear panes and the faint rattle of carriage wheels from the lane. No one had asked whether she could finish before full dark. No one needed to ask. Failure had never been treated as a single mistake in that house. It was treated as proof of her nature, repeated until it hardened into other people's certainty. She trimmed the excess thread with a penknife whose handle had once been pearl and was now plain wood where the inlay had chipped away. A small ruin, still useful, much like the woman bending above the page. When she lifted the board to test the repair, a drop from her sleeve struck the margin, blurred one printed line and made her jaw clench with sudden useless grief at how quickly water erased what years had set in type. The annex passage filled with perfume before voices arrived. Lavender first, then a sweeter rose-water note laid over it, deliberate and expensive, the scent of rooms where no one carried crates. The elder Miss Norwood entered without knocking and paused just inside, one gloved hand pinching her reticule as though the damp and glue fumes offended her blood. Her sister followed with a rustle of lilac silk and a narrow yawn half hidden behind her fan. They were both taller than Elizabeth by an inch, both carefully dressed for an evening call despite the weather, both polished to that smooth surface wealth purchased and effort maintained. The elder wore earrings that had belonged to Elizabeth's mother, small seed pearls in silver flowers, reset with brighter clasps. The younger had pinned at her throat a cameo that once fastened Elizabeth's winter cloak before the clasp was mislaid, and the cloak itself cut down for servant livery. They did not mention such things. They did not need to. "Still at accounts?" the elder asked, though the ledgers were open before her eyes. "Mamma says you tally slowly when left unwatched." Elizabeth rose because remaining seated would be called insolence. "The March and April balances will be complete within the hour." The younger stepped to the work table, tapped a nail against a stack of subscription cards, and smiled with bored precision. "Within the hour. You always speak as though time belongs to you." She lifted a card and read the name aloud, mispronouncing it for amusement. "Captain Volkoff. Is he one of your father's grim little scholars? We shall strike him. Mamma says foreign accounts invite confusion." Elizabeth held her spine straight and felt the old heat climb her throat. "Captain Volkoff pays quarterly in advance." "His account is clear." The elder's brows rose in practised surprise. "How bold she sounds in back rooms." She turned toward the door and called, not loudly yet loud enough for the clerk to hear, "Do you hear, Mr. Pike? Miss Ivanov protects debtors now." Laughter answered from the lending desk, dutiful and thin. The younger drifted behind Elizabeth's chair and flicked a damp lock of dark hair away from her collar with 2 fingers, as one might move thread from a cushion. "You are wet to the skin. No wonder customers complain of drafts." Elizabeth stepped away from that hand before she could stop herself. The movement was small. It was seen. The elder's mouth sharpened. "Careful! Gratitude suits you better." They selected 2 new novels from the repair shelf, though both bore fresh mending and had been reserved for paying patrons, and tucked them beneath their wraps without signing a ledger. At the threshold the younger looked back, eyes bright with that private excitement cruelty gave those who never feared consequence. "Lady Crowthorne asked at luncheon whether you were companion or servant. Mamma told her, neither. She is obligation." The table found it amusing. The door closed on their silk and laughter. The annex seemed colder after they left, and the spot at Elizabeth's throat where the younger had touched her burned as if marked. Mrs. Norwood came a few minutes later, exactly as Elizabeth had known she would, measured steps, key ring whispering against satin, expression arranged into benevolence for any witness and correction for the one person who knew its architecture. She did not cross the threshold at once. She stood in the doorframe and surveyed the room as if inspecting stable tack. "Mr. Pike informs me you disputed a household instruction in front of my daughters." Elizabeth kept her eyes on the ledger line because looking directly into that face always gave Mrs. Norwood another angle from which to strike. "I clarified an account, ma'am." The word was soft. It was enough to alter the air. Mrs. Norwood entered then, closed the door behind her, and laid a packet of folded notices on the table with 2 fingers. The wax seals bore copied initials meant to resemble a solicitor's hand. Elizabeth recognised them because she had been ordered to address the envelopes herself in March, then in April, then again last week, each one demanding payment against sums she had never seen documented in any original book. "You will copy these cleanly," Mrs. Norwood said. "The magistrate's clerk complained of your blotting. If our petition appears untidy, the blame will be yours." Elizabeth looked at the top sheet. Debt called due. Interest compounded. Penalty for concealment of assets. Her own name written in a careful legal script that made the theft of truth look like order. "These figures do not correspond to the trust register," she said, before caution could catch her tongue. Mrs. Norwood's head tilted, almost curious. "What register?" The lavender scent deepened as she leaned closer. "The one you have never seen because it does not concern you. Your father left confusion. I inherited duty." She let the sentence settle, then added with the quiet pleasure of someone polishing a blade, "Do not test me on documents. You have no standing." Elizabeth felt her pulse in her wrists. "I have his surname." "You have his creditors," Mrs. Norwood answered. "Names are only useful when backed by men who answer letters." She picked up Elizabeth's hidden notebook from the corner where it had slipped beneath a repair cloth, turned it once in her hand, and opened to the copied verse. Her mouth moved over the Russian lines without comprehension. "Still wasting candle on this?" She tossed the notebook down, not hard enough to damage, hard enough to humiliate. "Poetry does not pay coal bills. Copy the notices. Then carry my daughter's wraps to the carriage at 9. If you are late, the attic fire is extinguished tonight." She moved to go, then paused with one gloved hand on the latch. "And remember this, Elizabeth, I did not make your life small. Debt did. I merely keep you fed in spite of it." The door shut. The key turned from the outside, not locked, only tested, a reminder that she could be. For a long moment she did not move. Rain thudded harder against the panes. Somewhere beyond the annex, Mr. Pike coughed and counted coins from the day box, each clink a small, bright insult. Elizabeth lowered herself back to the chair and placed both palms flat on the table until the tremor in them slowed. She drew the notices toward her and copied the first line in a hand so steady it might have belonged to another woman, one with dry sleeves and warm supper waiting. Debtor. "Miss Elizabeth Ivanov. Sum due. All arrears and costs." She wrote each word cleanly and felt the shape of the lie like grit between her teeth. When she had finished 3 notices, she set down the pen and opened her notebook where it had fallen. The page Mrs. Norwood had touched bore a smudge at the corner. Nothing more. The lines remained legible. Her father's translation remained his, and hers by memory. She turned to the back leaves where she had kept, folded thin, a list begun 2 winters ago, and added to in secret whenever something vanished from the house under pretext of necessity. Mother's pearl earrings, blue shawl with silk fringe, walnut escritoire, bronze clock from study mantel, 8 silver spoons marked E.I., oak travelling chest with brass corners. Georgian Atlas, first edition, sold to Marsh and Son for £14. One carved icon from father's desk, misplaced. She had dates beside some entries, witness names beside others, and for 3 items she had copied auction advertisements clipped from old gazettes, proof that property called debt recovery had moved through public rooms with private signatures attached. Her dowry trust was not mist, not rumour, not childish wish. It had numbers. It had seals. It had been taken by method, not misfortune. She slid the list back into its hiding place and returned to the forged notices, because survival required obedience measured by the hour, while justice demanded memory measured by the year. By the time the church clock struck 8 through the rain, 5 clean copies lay drying near the lamp, The repaired volume sat stacked for morning collection, and her expression had settled into the same composure people mistook for meekness. It was not meekness, it was structure. She capped the ink, wrapped her wounded palm again, and reached for the next ledger with the same deliberate care she would one day use to place the truth before a room that could no longer afford to look away. The front bell crashed against its spring so hard the sound jumped through the annex wall, followed at once by the clatter of carriage wheels in the lane, and a man's voice carrying above the rain, sharp with command and rank. Mr. Pike swore under his breath in the lending room. Another clerk ran. Footsteps struck the boards in uneven bursts. Elizabeth set the ledger down, already half risen when the annex door flew inward, and Pike stood there flushed and damp at the collar, his hair flattened by weather and panic alike. "Leave those," he said. "Her ladyship wants the rear stacks cleared, at once." "Rear stacks are never opened after dusk. Tonight they are." He thrust a ring of keys toward her, then snatched one back. "No, this one stays with me. Take the inventory slips and stand by the revolving case in restricted. You are to answer if called and remain unseen. Otherwise, the Dowager Duchess is upstairs." The name landed like cold water down her spine. Everyone in the trade knew the Dowager Duchess of Halvan by reputation and account. Subscriptions paid in gold, requests sent on cream paper, margins filled with unforgiving notes in a hand so even it looked engraved. The rain outside seemed to press harder against the glass, as if the weather itself had leaned in to listen. From the front came Mrs. Norwood's voice, warm as sugared tea for public ears. "Mr. Pike, do not keep her Grace waiting. Miss Ivanov, if a single folio is out of order, I shall hold your wages for the quarter." Wages that had never been paid. Elizabeth did not answer. She gathered the inventory slips, wiped her fingers on her skirt to keep from smearing them, and moved through the passage into the lending room where lamps had been doubled, and every imperfection showed. Wet cloaks dripped onto clean tiles. A liveried footman stood near the door with the rain on his shoulders, and 2 household guards in dark coats watched the room with the rigid stillness of men who expected trouble and disliked uncertainty more than insult. One carried mud to his knees, the other had his hand near the hilt of a sword not drawn. Customers had retreated to the walls, pretending to browse while listening to every word. At the centre of it, in violet silk and pearls like polished teeth, the Dowager Duchess stood as if the room had been constructed around her and had better perform. 3 young women remained near the staircase beneath a single parasol held by a maid, each dressed for display in pale satin untouched by work, their gloves dry, their eyes alert with calculation. Bride candidates, Elizabeth thought with a bleak inward clarity, lined like porcelain for inspection, while rain ran from the roof, gutters and servants shook from cold at the threshold. Mrs. Norwood glided toward her with lavender and rose water preceding her by a heartbeat. The smile on her mouth did not reach her eyes. "Restricted stacks. Now, if her Grace asks for the Halvan estate letters, you hand them to me and lower your gaze. You are not to speak unless addressed." "Yes, ma'am." "Louder." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Norwood's fingers closed around Elizabeth's elbow and pressed just hard enough to warn. "And if those documents are misplaced, Miss Ivanov, I shall tell the guard who last touched them." The threat was clean. It needed no ornament. Debtor custody waited for women without patrons and without proof. Elizabeth felt the old twist of fear under her ribs and moved anyway, because stillness in that moment would be read as guilt. She crossed to the rear corridor, unlocked the narrow door, and entered restricted. The air there held old glue, leather, and trapped damp. High shelves rose in tight aisles. A single lamp burned on the central table, throwing shadows through the iron lattice overhead. At the far end stood the revolving bookshelf her father had once called a clever absurdity, a full-height case mounted on hidden pivots to conceal a service passage used by staff when the room had been private. She had turned it only twice in 4 years, both times for Mrs. Norwood, both times under watch. Now voices rose overhead from the gallery stair, the dowager's measured tone, a softer chorus of polite responses, the scrape of chairs being set in the upstairs reading room. Somewhere behind that, another sound threaded in from outside, hooves skidding, a guard calling to another man in clipped urgency. 9 struck from the church bell and trembled through the walls. The first thud came from behind the revolving case, not the creak of old wood, a body striking panelling, then a second impact, lower, followed by a rough intake of breath and a muttered curse in a man's voice too low to carry words. Elizabeth froze with one hand on the inventory slips. A palm hit the inside of the case once, hard. The shelf shuddered on its hinge. A moment later the hidden latch clicked from the other side, and the entire case shifted half an inch, enough to open a seam of darkness between books. Through it she saw rain-black wool, the edge of a shoulder, and a hand braced against the frame. Blood marked the cuff, not much, but bright even in dim light. The case moved again. A tall man stepped through the narrow opening and pulled it after him with controlled force. The shelves settled back into place with a muffled thump. He stood in the aisle breathing hard once, then once more, then not at all, as if he had dismissed pain by habit. Rain had darkened his greatcoat nearly black. Water tracked from his hair to his collar and down the hard line of his jaw. His face looked carved rather than born. Straight nose, mouth set flat, eyes the colour of storm water fixed on her with swift, assessing severity. "Close it," he said. "Now!" She did not ask who he was. She moved. Her palms slid on damp wood as she pushed the case the last fraction into lock. The latch caught. She turned back and found him closer than before, broad shoulders filling the aisle so completely there was no path around him. Voices sounded from the corridor outside, restricted. Guards this time. "Your Grace," one called, restrained but strained. "Report, sir." The man in front of her did not answer. He listened. His gaze stayed on her face. The name hit her only then, not from the guard's call alone, but from recognition layered over it. She had seen the profile engraved in newspapers after debates in the Lords, seen a younger version in an old county portrait catalogued under Halvan Arthur Bennett, 8th Duke. He looked older than the engraving, harder at the mouth, and less willing to be looked at. The Duke of Halvan stood in the restricted stacks, with rain on his coat and blood on his cuff, while his mother assembled brides upstairs. His voice came low, controlled. "If you scream, they will break this door and ask why." "I have no reason to scream, Your Grace." "Everyone has a reason. Not everyone has liberty to use it." A flicker crossed his face. Not surprise exactly. Recognition of resistance where obedience had been expected. From beyond the shelves, Mrs. Norwood called in her public tone. "Miss Ivanhoff, have you found the folios?" Elizabeth kept her eyes on the Duke. "No, ma'am," she answered, steady enough to carry. "The catalogue is out of sequence. I am correcting it." "Do not delay." The footsteps retreated. The guards remained somewhere near the corridor, boots shifting on boards. The Duke unfastened one glove with his teeth and tugged it free. His right hand bled from a shallow cut across the knuckles, likely from glass or iron. He ignored it. "How long until they enter?" "They do not enter without Mrs. Norwood." "That was not my question." 3 minutes if she doubts me, 10 if she believes me. And does she? She believes what is useful. He watched her another beat, then looked down at the torn seam in her sleeve, the damp bandage at her palm, the cheap wool gone shiny at the cuff from repeated mending. He took in her shaking hands, then the crate marks still livid at the base of her thumbs. When he spoke again, each observation landed like a verdict. "You are cold. You have not eaten. That dressing is makeshift. You are not here by choice." Her throat tightened with anger she had no right to show him and no strength to hide. "You know my choice, Your Grace? I know compulsion when I see it." A flush rose under her skin despite the cold. Men of rank usually preferred blindness dressed as courtesy. This one named what he saw and did not lower his gaze from it. The precision unsettled more than kindness would have. Above them a chair scraped. A woman laughed too brightly. The dowager said, "My son values discipline. He values lineage. He values restraint." The sentence drifted through the floorboards like a law being read aloud. The Duke's jaw tightened. The scar at the left side of his temple, faint and old, pulled pale against wet skin. "They brought them here." "The ladies? The candidates?" He said the word as though it were a military inventory. "My mother chose 3 brides for the season. Tonight she intended to parade obedience and call it harmony." A guard's voice came again from farther down the corridor. "No sight of His Grace in the lane." Another answered, "Check the rear gate." The Duke took one silent step closer. In the narrow aisle there was nowhere for Elizabeth to retreat except into the shelves. His hand came up and braced against the wood above her shoulder, not touching her, boxing her in with sheer presence. Rain and iron and wet wool filled the air between them. Her pulse moved hard at her throat. His did not show. "You will say you are alone if they ask." She met his eyes because looking down felt like surrender. "If they search, they will find you. They will not search if your face does not betray you." "My face has betrayed nothing for 4 years." For the first time, something like approval cut through his expression, brief and hard to trust. Outside, silk rustled in the corridor. Mrs. Norwood had returned sooner than expected. "Miss Ivanoff!" she called closer now. "Open the door." Elizabeth's breath stopped and started again. The Duke's hand stayed braced above her shoulder, his body immobile, a wall of dark wool and command. He spoke without taking his eyes from hers. "Do not open." The latch rattled once under Mrs. Norwood's testing grip. "Miss Ivanoff, answer me." Elizabeth lifted her voice. "One moment, ma'am. The lower shelf has split. I am binding it." "Then be quick. Her Grace requires the Halvan correspondence." The Duke's gaze sharpened at that. "What correspondence?" "Estate letters, old family papers. Mrs. Norwood keeps them locked when she can charge for access." "Where?" "In the compartment behind this case." The words left her before caution could intervene. She felt the risk as soon as they were spoken. He studied her face, reading calculation and fear both. "Why tell me?" "Because if she finds you here, she will say I lured you." "Lured?" "She always speaks first, and people believe the first version." His mouth flattened further, if such a thing was possible. "What does she hold over you?" "My father's trust papers." "Originals. I have never been permitted to see them." Mrs. Norwood knocked this time. 3 crisp strikes. "Elizabeth! Open!" The Duke looked toward the door, then back to her. The decision happened in his eyes and in the stillness that followed it. "Turn the case," he said. 2 inches only." She understood at once. The hidden seam would align with a blind panel and mask the space where he stood. If done wrong, the scrape would announce movement. If done right, he would vanish into shadow, and she would face Mrs. Norwood alone. Elizabeth moved to the shelf. Her wounded palm protested as she pushed. Wood shifted. Iron whispered. The case settled. He stepped into the narrow gap and disappeared from direct view. Only the line of his shoulder remained in darkness behind the books. "Now!" he said, barely above breath. "Open!" She crossed the aisle and lifted the latch. Mrs. Norwood entered in a spill of lavender and satin, her smile ready for rebuke. It faltered when she saw Elizabeth alone, damp, pale, and breathing too carefully. "Why is this room shut?" "Catalogue work, ma'am." Mrs. Norwood's eyes narrowed. "You are lying." Elizabeth held still. "No, ma'am." Mrs. Norwood took 2 steps in, glanced toward the revolving case, then back to Elizabeth's face, as if searching for evidence that fear had finally made her useful. For one stretched second, neither woman moved. Rain struck the panes. Voices drifted from the reading room above. In the dark seam behind the bookshelf, the Duke remained silent as stone. "Fetch the Halvan letters," Mrs. Norwood said softly, "and do not touch what does not belong to you." Elizabeth turned toward the case with her pulse hammering and the Duke's hidden presence at her back, every inch of the room charged by what each of them now knew. Elizabeth turned toward the revolving case with measured steps, aware of Mrs. Norwood's eyes fixed on the back of her neck. The hidden seam lay exactly where the lamp shadow thickened. She set the inventory slips on a lower shelf, pressed her palm to the carved edge, and rotated the case 1 handspan farther than needed for the public compartment. Inside the darkness, unseen by Mrs. Norwood's angle, a gloved hand appeared for 1 swift moment and placed a packet against her fingers. The Duke's hand, warm despite the rain, steady despite the cut at his knuckles. She drew the packet into view as if lifting it from the shelf itself, then reached deeper and withdrew 3 folios tied in dark ribbon, the Halvan crest stamped in gold at each spine. She closed the panel with a soft click and turned back. Mrs. Norwood took the folios at once, checked the crest, and narrowed her eyes. "Only 3? "Only 3 in the listed series, ma'am." Mrs. Norwood stepped closer. Lavender and rose water settled around Elizabeth like a net. "You are certain no private correspondence was stored with them?" Elizabeth held the woman's gaze. "I am certain." The lie sat clean on her tongue. She had not opened the packet in her hand. She had not even looked at the seal. Yet she knew, with the cold certainty of survival, that if Mrs. Norwood saw anything unaccounted for, accusation would follow before breath. From the corridor, a footman called, "Her Grace requests the documents now." Mrs. Norwood gave Elizabeth a final look, one that promised later reckoning, and moved to the door. "Bring the inventory slips. You will stand behind the escritoire and remain silent." Elizabeth followed, closing restricted behind her, with care that did not betray haste. As soon as the latch caught, she folded the packet under the wide cuff of her sleeve and pressed her forearm against her ribs to hold it in place. The corridor was bright with doubled lamps. Rain rattled in the gutters outside. The guards had shifted nearer the front hall, searching the lane through the open door. No one looked at her. That was her one advantage and her oldest wound. Upstairs, the private reading room had been arranged like a stage set for judgment. A coal fire burned low, not for warmth but for appearance. The Dowager Duchess sat upright in a high-backed chair near the mantel. Violet silk pooled in precise folds, pearls at her throat reflecting every lamp. The 3 young ladies stood in a shallow crescent before her, each one pale and polished, each one trying to look serene while watching the others for weakness. A tea service waited untouched. On the central table lay genealogies, estate maps, and a silver bell. And near the far window, half hidden by the curtain, a small boy sat on the floor with his knees drawn to his chest. His coat was velvet too fine for play, his hair dark like his father's, had fallen across his brow in damp curls where he had pressed his head against the glass. He could not have been more than 8. He watched the room with guarded hostility, as if every sentence spoken there had been spoken against him. Mrs. Norwood crossed to the dowager with a shallow curtsy and offered the folios. "Your Grace, the requested correspondence." The dowager accepted them without thanks, untied one ribbon, and began to skim the first pages. Her voice cut through the room, crisp as paper. "Lady Agnes, your family has held Westmere only 2 generations, yes? Lady Penelope, your mother is connected to the Fenwick line through marriage, not blood. Lady Clara, I require clarity regarding your trusteeship." She turned a page with one gloved finger. "Precision, ladies! Rank is a matter of record." A thunderclap rolled over the roof. The boy near the window flinched hard, clapped both hands over his ears, and kicked the leg of the central table. The silver bell toppled, a cup slid, struck the carpet, and shattered at the rim. All 3 ladies recoiled at once. "Good heavens!" one breathed. The dowager did not rise. "Peregrine, control yourself!" The boy's shoulders tightened further. He did not answer. Mrs. Norwood's expression softened into public pity. "The poor child is overset by weather. Miss Ivanoff, remove him, quietly." Elizabeth moved before she had fully thought it through. She set the inventory slips on the escritoire, crossed the carpet, and lowered herself to one knee a short distance from the boy so she would not crowd him. Up close she saw the signs others had missed or ignored: the bitten skin at his thumb, the rigid set of his jaw, the way his breath came shallow and fast, as if each inhale had to be argued for. His left wrist bore a silk cord wound too tightly, likely tied by his own hand, and twisted in agitation until the skin beneath had gone red. "Master Peregrine," she said softly, "may I sit here?" He glanced at her once, suspicious, then away. She sat anyway, not touching him. "The thunder is loud tonight." He gave no reply. Behind her one of the ladies whispered, not quietly enough, "Must this occur now?" Another answered, "I had not expected nursery scenes." The words landed like pins. Elizabeth ignored them. She looked at the boy's hands instead. "My father used to count storms," she said. "He said thunder tells one how far away the worst of it has gone. Would you like to test whether he was right?" A pause. Then, almost grudgingly, the boy lowered one hand from his ear. The next rumble came faint and delayed. Elizabeth counted under her breath in Russian, steady and low. "Raz, dva, tri, shetira." She let the sound of the language fill the small space between them, not loud enough for spectacle, only enough for rhythm. 4, that one is farther away. Peregrine's eyes shifted to her face, startled by the unfamiliar words. "What is that?" "Russian, my father's first language." She kept her tone plain. "Would you like the English as well?" He hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. 1, 2, 3, 4. Another flash lit the window. He tensed. She counted again. Same cadence, same calm. This time he mouthed the last number with her before the thunder reached them. By the time the hall clock below struck 9:30, he had taken both hands from his ears. The dowager watched over the edge of her folio, expression unreadable. Mrs. Norwood stood stiff at the sideboard, displeasure sharpening every line of her face. The brides looked from child to dowager to one another, unsure whether this was an interlude to endure or a test they were failing. Peregrine looked down at his wrist and winced. Elizabeth saw the silk cord had cut shallow grooves into his skin. "May I?" she asked, touching the air near his hand. He held out his arm without speaking. She untied the knot, unwound the cord, and rubbed warmth gently into the reddened skin with her thumb. "Too tight," she murmured. "You did not mean to hurt it, but you did," he swallowed. "I wanted it to stop shaking." His honesty pierced her. She answered with equal plainness, "It shakes because it's frightened, not because it's weak." At the table, Lady Penelope gave a small, disbelieving laugh. "Is she instructing him now?" The dowager did not look at her. "Silence." The single word dropped like a stone in water. No one spoke. Elizabeth glanced around for distraction and saw, half under the settee, a wooden puzzle box carved with a ship and compass points. One panel had stuck halfway open. She reached for it and set it between them. "Do you know this toy?" Peregrine's chin lifted a fraction. "It was my mother's. It opens 3 ways. No one does it right." "Show me." For the first time his posture shifted from recoil to focus. He took the box, rotated the carved lid, pressed a hidden catch with the side of his thumb, and slid a panel free. Inside lay a folded scrap of paper bearing a short line in French. He frowned at it. "She wrote those," he said. "No one reads them properly." Elizabeth read the line quietly, then translated it into English without flourish. His eyes widened. "You read that fast." "I read what is in front of me." He considered this, then thrust the paper toward her. "Read it again." She did. He listened, breathing slower now, one hand still wrapped around the loosened silk cord. At the doorway, unnoticed by most of the room, a tall figure in a dry black coat came to a stop and did not enter. The Duke of Halvan had changed his greatcoat and bound his wounded hand, but the severity in his face remained. He stood in shadow where the corridor lamp did not quite reach, gaze fixed on the carpet scene before him. His nephew sitting cross-legged beside the woman behind the library shelves, both bent over a puzzle box as rain moved against the windows. Elizabeth did not see him. She kept her attention on Peregrine. "Another line," the boy demanded, rummaging in the puzzle compartment. He produced a second slip, this one in a cramped hand, blotched as if written in haste. "This one no one can read." She took it, deciphered the script, and translated. "When thunder speaks, count the heartbeats and remember that storms move onward." Peregrine stared at the paper, then at her. "She used to say that?" "I believe she still does," Elizabeth answered before caution could silence tenderness. The boy's mouth trembled once and steadied. He leaned very slightly against her sleeve. She did not move away. A chair leg scraped. The dowager rose at last and crossed the room with measured dignity. She stopped 2 paces from them. "Miss Ivanoff," she said, "where did you learn French and Russian?" "At home, Your Grace. My father was a translator." "Edward Ivanoff." It was not a question. Elizabeth inclined her head. The dowager's gaze sharpened. "I recall his work. He corrected my husband's quotations without apology." "Then he was accurate, Your Grace." A flicker at the dowager's mouth. Not quite a smile. "He was insufferably accurate." Behind them, Mrs. Norwood intervened swiftly. "Your Grace, Miss Ivanoff has useful habits, but she is only a household dependent. If Master Peregrine requires a proper governess, I can provide names." Peregrine clutched the puzzle box tighter and spoke for the first time above a murmur. "No." Every head turned. The child looked directly at his grandmother. "I want her." Mrs. Norwood's colour rose. "Master Peregrine, that is not your decision." The Duke stepped fully into the room then, voice low and edged with command. "It is not yours either." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain seemed to withdraw for a breath. Mrs. Norwood pivoted, startled enough to drop her courtly mask. "Your Grace, we had understood you were delayed." "I was occupied." His gaze moved once across the room, taking in the broken cup, the untouched tea, the bride standing rigid by the mantel, the boy on the carpet beside Elizabeth. Then his eyes settled on Elizabeth's hand, where she still held the translated slip. "Continue," he said to her. The word carried no explanation, only order, yet it was protection, as plainly as if he had placed a wall around her. Elizabeth looked from him to Peregrine. The boy's fingers had begun to tighten again on the silk cord. She turned back to him, resumed the measured counting game when thunder rolled once more, and drew him through it until his shoulders lowered and his breathing steadied. She rewrapped the cord at his wrist, loose this time, showing him how to tie a bow that would release with one pull. "Like this," she said, "never tighter than comfort." He practiced the knot twice, then once more, concentration replacing panic. Lady Agnes cleared her throat delicately. "Your Grace, are we to continue the interview?" The Duke did not turn. "No." The single syllable ended the room's pretence more efficiently than any speech. The Dowager returned to her chair with grave composure. "Ladies, you have my thanks for attending in dreadful weather. My secretary will send regrets and carriages." One bride looked affronted. Another looked relieved. The third looked at Elizabeth with open disdain, as though dismissal itself had become her fault. They curtsied in turn and withdrew with their maid, skirts whispering over carpet, disappointment and calculation trailing behind them like perfume. Mrs. Norwood remained, hands clasped too tightly at her waist. "Your Grace, if this is regarding the library incident, I assure you Miss Ivanov can be corrected. She is prone to dramatics." Elizabeth felt Peregrine stiffen beside her. She kept her face neutral. The Duke's answer was quiet enough that everyone had to listen. "I have seen no dramatics from Miss Ivanov. I have seen competence." Mrs. Norwood attempted a laugh that did not settle. "She is merely practised at seeking sympathy." Peregrine spoke again, sharper now. "She fixed it." No one asked what he meant. His certainty was enough. The Dowager tapped one finger on the folio spine. "Mrs. Norwood, that will do." A footman appeared in the doorway to announce the bride's carriages were ready. The Dowager dismissed him with a nod and turned back to Elizabeth. "Miss Ivanov," she said, "remain until my grandson sleeps. Then you may return to your duties." Mrs. Norwood opened her mouth to object. The Dowager did not look at her when she added, "That is not a request." The older woman bowed, silk rustling with contained fury, and retreated to the corridor where she could no longer poison the room with polite contempt. Elizabeth stayed on the carpet beside Peregrine, while the fire settled lower and the rain thinned to a fine hiss against the panes. She read the French lines again, then translated them into simple English he could hold in memory. When he stumbled over a word, she waited without correction until he found it himself. He did, jaw set, in the same stubborn line she had seen on his uncle's face. At last his eyelids sagged. A nursemaid came quietly and lifted him, puzzle box and all. He reached one hand toward Elizabeth as he was carried out, then let it fall once he saw she watched. Only when the door closed behind them did she rise. Her knees ached. Her sleeve still concealed the sealed packet taken from the hidden case. She had nearly forgotten it in the labour of calming someone else's fear. The room had emptied to 4 people, the Dowager at her chair, the Duke near the hearth, Elizabeth by the window, and Rain in the dark outside. The Dowager gathered the Halvan folios and stood. "We shall speak in the morning, Arthur," she said to her son. "Not tonight." He inclined his head once. She passed Elizabeth without pause, but at the threshold she said, "Your father translated grief as if it were grammar. You have his steadiness." Then she was gone. Elizabeth remained where she was, hands clasped to hide their tremor. The Duke did not move for several breaths. Firelight marked the angles of his face, the bandage at his knuckles, the stillness he wore like armour. At length he crossed to the table, lifted the fallen silver bell, and set it upright with exact care. "You chose correctly," he said, not looking at her yet. She understood at once that he did not mean the bell. "I chose a child over a performance, Your Grace." His gaze met hers then, direct and not cold at all beneath it. Most people in this house chose performance. The words settled between them, heavy with what he had witnessed and what she had risked to keep hidden. Her forearm still pressed the sealed packet against her ribs, proof that the night had not finished with either of them. The Duke's gaze dropped once, not to her face, but to the rigid line of her arm and the way she held herself as if one side of her body had turned to stone. Nothing in his expression softened. That made what he said next feel sharper. "Give it to me!" She did not move. "Your Grace?" "The packet in your sleeve." His voice stayed low, almost level. "If Mrs. Norwood sends a maid to search you before you leave this floor, you will be accused of theft. Give it to me now." The room seemed to contract around the words. Firelight shifted over the silver on the tea tray. Rain ran in thin threads down the window glass, no longer violent, only relentless. Elizabeth felt her pulse in her injured palm and in the hollow below her throat. "It may concern my father's trust," she said. "I cannot surrender it blindly." His eyes lifted to hers, storm grey, unreadable, precise. "I am not asking for surrender. I am preventing seizure." She heard the truth in that and hated that she needed it. Her fingers found the edge of the packet beneath wet wool. For one instant she considered lying again. He watched her without impatience, without mercy, and without looking away. She drew the packet free and held it, not yet offering it. "If you intend to return it to your mother," she said, "say it plainly." He gave one short shake of his head. "I intend to keep it out of her hands and out of Mrs. Norwood's hands until it's copied, witnessed, and entered in a magistrate's register." The words struck through her like heat after cold. Procedure, not promise, structure she could trust more than comfort. She placed the packet in his uninjured hand. He turned it under the lamp. The seal had been pressed in dark red wax, with a stamp worn at one edge, but still legible. A narrow shield and the letter I worked into the crest line. Her father's signet mark from years before debt consumed their name. The Duke's jaw tightened. He did not break the seal yet. "You recognize this in the stacks," he said. "I recognize the impression, not the contents." "And you still carried it under her nose." "She taught me to survive by carrying what she must not see." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, something closer to grim acknowledgement. From the corridor came the murmur of servants clearing cups, the tread of feet, the faint clink of porcelain gathered into trays. The house had resumed its nightly machinery, as if no collision had occurred in its centre. That ordinary sound unsettled her more than the storm had. The Duke folded the packet into the inner pocket of his coat and buttoned it with deliberate care. "From this moment, if anyone asks, those folios remained in your hand and went directly to my mother. Nothing else was recovered." "You ask me to lie to a duchess. I order you to remain unarrested." It was such a hard sentence that it landed as care. Elizabeth looked down because her eyes had begun to burn for no useful reason. His next command came immediately. "Sit." "I am well enough to stand." "You are swaying." "I am not." "You are." He set the silver bell down and stepped toward the sideboard. "Sit, Miss Ivanov." No one had spoken her name in that tone before. Not tenderness, not pity. Recognition edged with authority. She lowered herself to the nearest chair because refusing would have been vanity, and vanity was for women who had eaten. He rang once. A footman appeared almost at once at the doorway, eyes lowered. "Bread, broth, and hot tea," the Duke said. "Now, for Miss Ivanoff, and send Mrs. Davies, not Mrs. Norwood's maid." "Yes, Your Grace." No announcements, no discussion. The footman bowed and vanished. Elizabeth stared at the carpet pattern, then at her own hands. "You have changed the household order with one sentence." "I have changed one order. More remain." At the quarter hour, the hall clock struck 10, with measured iron notes that moved through the floorboards. The sound marked time as cleanly as a blade. She became suddenly aware of the ache in her knees, the drag of her soaked hem, the sting at her split palm, the fatigue that had gone beyond trembling into numbness. The Duke stood by the hearth and said nothing for several breaths. Then he held out his injured hand, palm down, as if presenting evidence. "Bandage this properly." She looked up. "There are surgeons in this house." "I did not summon a surgeon." "You summoned broth." "And you?" His eyes did not leave hers. "Bandage it." She rose, crossed to the side table, and found a clean strip of linen in the drawer beside the tea-caddy. There was a basin with fresh water left from the abandoned service. She poured it, dipped a cloth, and came back to him. Up close she could see where the cut crossed his knuckles in a shallow diagonal, already clotted at the edges but dirty from rain and grit. "This will sting," she said. "Do it." She cleaned the wound with careful pressure. His hand did not flinch. His shoulders did not move. The stillness in him felt unnatural at first, then intentional, as if he had chosen not to withdraw from pain because retreat had become a habit. He refused in this one narrow thing. "You should not close your fist tonight," she said. "The skin will tear again." "I am not likely to sleep." "Then keep it open anyway." A quieter line entered his voice. "Do you issue commands to everyone?" "Only those who bleed on catalogue shelves." For the first time he almost smiled. It vanished before it fully formed. She wrapped the linen around his hand, tied it with a flat knot, and checked circulation by pressing lightly against his fingertips. Warmth returned quickly. "Healthy, strong, better," she said. He studied her face instead of the bandage. "You set my nephew's breathing in less than 10 minutes. He set it himself. I only gave him count and rhythm. You gave him permission not to be ashamed." The statement was so direct it left no place to hide. She reached for the cloth to busy her hands and found she had already folded it twice. "He is a child," she said. "He should not be shamed for fear." "Yet he has been." The Duke's tone cooled. "In this house, fear is treated as failure. You did not treat it that way." The door opened softly. An older woman with clear grey eyes entered carrying a tray, followed by the footman with a second. Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper from Halvan House, if memory served from whispers among trade staff. She set broth, bread and tea on the low table, without looking surprised to find Elizabeth seated in a chair meant for family. "Your Grace," she said, "Mrs. Davies." He inclined his head. "Miss Ivanoff will eat before she leaves this floor. Ensure no one interrupts." Mrs. Davies's gaze flicked once to Elizabeth's torn sleeve, then to the wrapped palm, then back to the Duke. Something like approval settled in her expression, discreet and swift. "It will be done, Your Grace." When the servants had withdrawn and the door closed again, silence returned, denser now because it carried witness. Elizabeth lifted the spoon. The broth smelled of leek and marrow and thyme. Her stomach cramped at the first swallow, then eased by degrees as warmth spread through her chest. The Duke didn't sit. "You may take the other chair," she said quietly, almost against her will. "I am well enough to stand." She could not tell whether it was answer or mirror. He moved to the window instead and stood with one shoulder near the pane, looking out at the courtyard where rain glossed cobbles black. He remained there long enough for her to finish half the bowl. Each time she set the spoon down, he turned his head slightly, as if measuring whether she would stop too soon. She resumed before he could speak. When she reached for bread, he said, still facing the glass, "In Restricted, when Norwood called you half foreign refuse, you did not lower your eyes." The crust broke in her hand. She had not known he had noticed that. "I learned early that lowering one's eyes is read as confession." "I heard every word she said." The admission entered the room like another person. He had been in darkness inches away, listening as Mrs. Norwood named and diminished and threatened. He had heard, and he had not interrupted because interruption would have exposed her. The logic was sound. The memory still scraped. "You remained silent," she said, before she could stop herself. "Yes." She waited, so that she would keep speaking. He turned from the window then, gaze severe. People reveal method when they believe themselves unobserved by consequence. "She gave me method." Elizabeth set the bread down carefully. "Method for what?" "For ending her leverage." The fire popped once in the grate. Outside, a carriage rolled through the gate and away. Somewhere in the corridor, a maid laughed too brightly, then hushed herself. He crossed back to the hearth and stood opposite her, the low table between them like a border. "My mother intends to discuss alliances tomorrow morning," he said. "She will pretend tonight did not occur. Mrs. Norwood will attempt to move papers before dawn. She has done so before." "How do you know?" "Because the ledger compartment behind the revolving shelf has been opened 6 times this month outside library hours." He spoke as if reciting weather reports. "I set chalk on the hinge 2 weeks ago. The mark broke each time. I did not have proof of what was removed until tonight." She stared at him. "You have been watching the shelf." "I have been watching the room." A beat. "And the woman behind it." Heat rose under her skin, sharp and unwelcome. She lowered her gaze to the tea so she could keep her voice level. "Why?" "Because someone was correcting my father's Greek quotations in the margins before my mother could display them at supper." His tone held the faintest edge of incredulity. "Because account books appeared balanced in a hand too disciplined to belong to Pike. Because my nephew repeated a Russian counting cadence last month after visiting this library and slept through thunder for the first time in a year." He paused. The next line came lower. "Because you were being erased in plain sight, and the erasure was not accidental." She could not answer at once. The room seemed suddenly too warm, then too cold. No one had ever assembled the fragments of her life into a coherent shape and handed it back to her as fact. He watched her in that same relentless stillness. "Eat." She obeyed. When the bowl was empty, she set it down and folded her hands in her lap. "What do you require of me, Your Grace?" "Accuracy, names, dates. Every item removed from Ivanov House that can be traced. Every notice you were made to copy. Every witness who heard Norwood claim authority over your trust." "I have a list." "I know." Her head lifted. "How?" "You tucked folded paper into the back of your notebook after she left the annex. You touched your sleeve 3 times afterward to ensure it remained there. People touch what they cannot afford to lose." The observation was intimate in a way that felt more dangerous than nearness. She drew one breath, then another. "You were watching me then as well." "I was in the upper gallery. My mother believed I had gone to greet the brides. And you did not? No. He looked down at his bandaged hand, flexed his fingers once, then stilled them again. My mother chose 3 brides for the season, he said. The line was quiet and stripped of any performance. I will not be paraded into a contract while forgery sits in my own library, and a child is used as decoration to secure it. He lifted his eyes to hers, and the command followed, final and unadorned. You will not return to Ivanov House tonight. Her spine went rigid. If I do not return, Mrs. Norwood will claim I absconded with records. She may claim what she likes. She will not claim you. His voice hardened. Mrs. Davies has prepared the West schoolroom at Halvan House. You will sleep there under my household protection until the magistrate receives your statement. She heard the care in the architecture of it, and still bristled at the force. You issue this as decree. Yes. I am not your servant. No. He took one step closer, enough that firelight caught the planes of his face and the old scar at his temple. You are the principal injured party in a fraud tied to my family papers. That gives you standing. It gives me jurisdiction. It gives Norwood one less night to bury evidence. The crux was legal, not personal. It steadied her more than any reassurance could have. She rose slowly. If I come under your protection, it is for testimony and document recovery, not dependence. Agreed. I retain copies of every statement I sign. Agreed. My father's name is restored in any filing where it was falsified. Agreed. His answers came without hesitation, as if he had expected each demand and approved it before she spoke. At length she said, Then I will come. The words changed the shape of the room. Not rescue accepted. Terms established. He inclined his head once, a gesture almost formal enough to be a bow. Good. He moved to the door and opened it himself, rather than summoning a servant to do it. In the corridor, lamps burned low, and the household had thinned to night staff. Mrs. Davies stood waiting at a discreet distance with a dry cloak folded over her arm. She stepped forward and placed it around Elizabeth's shoulders with quiet efficiency. As they began down the corridor, the Duke fell into step half a pace behind and did not pass her. He did not touch her. He did not leave. His presence held steady at her back all the way to the private stair, a wall of dark wool and unspoken resolve, and for the first time in 4 years Elizabeth descended toward an unknown room without feeling that she was walking alone. At the foot of the private stair, the night porter opened the side door and wet wind moved across the passage like cold cloth. A covered carriage waited under the arch with Halvan livery on the lamps. 2 guards stood at the step, rain shining on their shoulders. Elizabeth paused with one hand on the cloak Mrs. Davies had settled around her, because the old instinct to ask permission from Mrs. Norwood still rose before every movement. The Duke did not touch her. He only said, "Inside." She entered. He followed. The door shut, and the city noise dropped to muffled iron and rain. They crossed 3 streets in silence. Lantern lights slid over his face and vanished with each turn. He held his injured hand open on his knee, exactly as she had ordered. That obedience unsettled her more than command. At Halvan House, the servants admitted them through the family entrance, not the rear court. Mrs. Davies led Elizabeth past a long schoolroom with maps on the wall and a banked fire already lit, then stopped at a writing table where fresh paper, 2 inkstands, and sealing wax had been set in readiness. "You will take broth again while it's warm," Mrs. Davies said. "Then you will write what you saw, every line." Elizabeth looked toward the Duke. Now, he said, "before memory is attacked. By 11 the rain had thinned to a steady hiss against the south windows. Elizabeth sat at the writing table with her notebook open, the hidden list unfolded beside it, and wrote her statement in a clean hand that did not betray how hard her pulse struck. She recorded the forged notices she had been ordered to copy, the dates she had addressed false petitions, the items removed from Ivanov House with auction references, the key patterns, the locked chests, the threats. She recorded the words spoken in restricted, half-foreign refuse, debtor custody. She did not soften any line. At the next table, a magistrate's clerk, in plain black, copied each page under dictation and sanded the wet ink. A solicitor named Mr. Fenwick checked names against parish and auction records brought from the Halvan archive. Mrs. Davies witnessed both copies with deliberate care. When the clerk reached the final page, the Duke placed the sealed packet on the table and broke the wax in full view of all present. Inside lay 3 folded documents and 1 narrow key wrapped in linen. The first paper was Edward Ivanov's codicil, signed and witnessed, assigning Elizabeth's dowry trust to remain separate from marital assets and naming temporary protective oversight to the late Duke of Halvan until Elizabeth's majority. The second was a trust ledger extract, bearing withdrawals made after Edward's death, with signatures that did not match the witness hand. The third was a letter from Edward, brief and blunt, warning that if he died during active debt disputes, Mrs. Norwood has no legal authority to administer my daughter's trust under any title she may claim. The room held still while Mr. Fenwick read each line aloud. The Dowager Duchess, who had entered without announcement and stood near the mantel in plain dark silk rather than court violet, listened with her hands clasped on her cane. When the reading ended, she looked once at Elizabeth and said, "I stopped speaking in the library because I suspected fraud and lacked proof. That omission was mine. It ends tonight." She turned to the magistrate's clerk. "Record that I identify Edward Ivanov's hand from prior correspondence and attest this codicil as consistent with documents in Halvan possession." The clerk bowed and wrote. A guard captain entered, mud to his knees, and saluted the Duke. "Your Grace, restricted stacks secured, hidden compartment examined in witness of Constable Reeve, chalk traces present on the hinge as you marked. Mrs. Norwood's key ring recovered from her desk. Mr. Pike attempted to leave by rear lane with 2 account books and has been stopped. Items are in the outer office." "Bring them." The account books came wrapped in sailcloth against weather. One held subscription balances with names struck through in fresh ink, including Captain Volkov, despite paid quarters. The other listed trust withdrawals coded as household repairs, carriage hire, and school fees, never rendered. Elizabeth identified her own copied hand, where she had been forced to write headings, and identified additions not hers, layered later over clean columns. The forged notices from the annex were produced and matched to draft versions in Mrs. Norwood's desk. Every physical item now lay on one table, named, witnessed, and entered into record. The clock in the schoolroom struck 1:15 midnight when Mr. Fenwick laid out 2 final papers. First, petition for immediate injunction and supervised removal from Ivanov House by dawn. Second, restitution instrument restoring Miss Ivanov's legal control over trust assets, pending full hearing. He looked to Elizabeth. "Read before you sign." She read each line twice. She corrected one amount where a clerk had transposed shillings. She added one sentence in her own hand. "No movable property purchased with trust funds may be retained by Mrs. Norwood." Mr. Fenwick nodded and incorporated it. She signed. The magistrate's clerk signed. Mrs. Davies signed as witness. The Duke signed as petitioner where jurisdiction attached through Halvan guardianship. The dowager sealed it with her ring. Only then did the Duke place a third document before her, separate from the legal stack. Heavy cream paper, marriage articles draft. Elizabeth did not touch it. This was not part of testimony. No, he said, it is a part of what follows, if you choose it. The dowager watched him without interruption. Mr. Fenwick lowered his eyes to the desk, tact made visible. The fire settled with a soft fall of ash. The Duke spoke in the same stripped tone he had used all night. My mother chose 3 brides for the season. I choose the woman behind the bookshelf. Silence held. It was not soft silence. It was courtroom silence, where one answer alters every life in the room. Elizabeth looked at the draft and then at him. If I marry, it will not be as gratitude. I know. It will not extinguish my separate property. It will not. My name remains Ivanov in trust filings and in any scholarly publication. Yes. Peregrine's instruction remains under my discretion where his care is concerned. A beat passed. Agreed. She set her hand on the paper but did not sign yet. Then add this. Any settlement entered tonight is void if restitution orders are delayed or diluted. Mr. Fenwick inhaled sharply, then hid it. The Duke answered before the solicitor could speak. Add it. The clause was written. Sanded, read aloud. She signed with a hand that no longer shook. He signed beneath her name. The dowager witnessed, without comment. Midnight struck on the final sealing press. Before dawn, the rain stopped. A pale line opened in the eastern sky as the injunction party reached Ivanov House. Constable Reeve, 2 city officers, Mr. Fenwick, Mrs. Davies, Elizabeth, and the Duke. Mrs. Norwood appeared in the front hall in travelling silk thrown over a night wrapper, lavender still at her throat, fury sharpening her voice into something almost shrill. This is unlawful. She is dependent. She owns nothing. Constable Reeve read the order aloud. Mr. Fenwick presented the codicil and restitution instrument. Mrs. Norwood demanded to see signatures, then demanded a private conversation with the dowager, then demanded delay until counsel could be sent. Each request was denied in turn. You may take clothing and personal effects, demonstrably purchased from your own accounts, Reeve said. All disputed property remains. The stepsisters came down half-dressed and white with outrage. The elder reached toward the pearl earrings at her ears as if to protect them. Mrs. Davies stepped forward with a ledger and a calm voice. Those are listed under Ivanov Trust Disbursements, Year 1. They remain. By first light, trunks not tied to trust funds were loaded into Mrs. Norwood's own carriage under supervision. The blue shawl, the walnut escritoire, and the carved icon were recorded as recovered or traced for return, where already sold. The Georgian atlas was noted as unrecoverable from a distant buyer. Restitution value entered. The forged debt notices were sealed into magistrate evidence bags. Mr. Pike's statement, taken in the hall with ink still on his cuffs, confirmed he had altered books under Mrs. Norwood's instruction for wages and protection from dismissal. He named dates. He named sums. He named where she kept duplicate seals. When Mrs. Norwood finally stepped into her carriage, she turned once toward Elizabeth with a look full of practised contempt and something rawer beneath it, as if disbelief had arrived too late to serve her. You think this elevates you, she said. It only exposes what you are. Elizabeth stood on the threshold that had once been her father's and answered in a steady voice that carried to the officers and the waking street. Yes, it does. The carriage door shut. Wheels moved. Lavender thinned in the morning air and was gone. In the quiet after, Elizabeth went directly to the old study. Dust lay thick on the mantel where books had been. She set her notebook on the desk, placed her palm over the cover, and breathed once, deeply, without bracing for interruption. Behind her, the Duke waited at the doorway and did not cross until she turned. "What remains unresolved?" he asked. She looked around the room at shelves half empty and one window newly bright with day. "Nothing legal." "And personally?" She considered, then answered with the same precision she had demanded all night. "Personally, we begin with honesty and work." He inclined his head, accepting terms as if receiving orders from an equal. "Then we begin." By noon, copies of every signed instrument had been placed in Elizabeth's hands, one at Halvan House, one at the magistrate's office, one in the Ivanov study strongbox with the recovered key from the packet. Peregrine arrived after lessons with the puzzle box under his arm and asked, with grave formality, whether she would read the French line again before thunder season returned. She said yes. The dowager, passing through the doorway, paused long enough to say she had not forgotten her unfinished sentence in the library and would not leave it unfinished now. Your father was right in argument and wrong in trusting charm. You are right in both. That evening, when lamps were lit and rain did not come, Elizabeth stood before the rebuilt shelf in the Halvan Library Annex, while clerks re-shelved ledgers under her direction. She heard footsteps behind her, knew the cadence, and did not turn at once. The Duke stopped beside the revolving case where they had first stood in darkness, command and fear between them. Now the case was open, hinge exposed, chalk cleaned, mechanism honest in the light. He closed it gently and said, "No hidden compartments." She met his eyes. "No hidden terms." The door to the annex closed softly on a room in order, and it did not lock.